March 24, 1944, 5 minutes before midnight, Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade stood at the open door of his burning Lancaster bomber 18,000 feet above Germany and looked down into darkness. Flames consumed the aircraft behind him, spreading from the shattered wing tanks through the fuselage and threatening to reach the rear turret where moments ago he'd been sitting alone in the frozen night. His parachute pack hung on its storage rack 6 feet away through a wall of fire, on the silk canopy already melting from the heat. 2 choices remained: stay in the turret and burn alive, or jump without a parachute and die when he hit the ground 3 miles below. 21 years old, a market gardener from Norfolk who'd spent his life working in soil and sunlight before the war pulled him into the sky. Alkemade had never imagined himself as someone special or brave or destined for anything beyond growing vegetables and living quietly. 90 seconds from now, he would be falling through darkness at 120 miles per hour with nothing to slow his descent, every law of physics declaring his survival impossible, every medical professional who would later examine the case insisting that what happened next could not have happened. 3 hours after he jumped, Alkemade woke up lying in snow with a sprained knee. Germans found him in a pine forest, carried him to a hospital, listened to his story about falling without a parachute, and accused him of being a spy who'd buried his chute to hide the evidence. The Gestapo interrogated him, threatened him, sent soldiers to search the wreckage of his bomber, and those soldiers found exactly what Alkemade said they'd find: his parachute still clipped to its rack inside the aircraft, burned beyond use, never deployed. April 25, 1944. German authorities issued an official certificate stating that Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade of the Royal Air Force had survived a fall from approximately 18,000 feet without a parachute after abandoning his burning aircraft over enemy territory, the only time in recorded history an enemy government certified an impossible survival with a legal document. This is how the man who fell from the sky lived to tell about it. Tail gunners in RAF Bomber Command occupied the most dangerous position in the entire air war, not the most celebrated or glamorous, but simply the most likely to get you killed before your tour ended. Statistics offered no comfort and little ambiguity. 1 tail gunner in 2 died, a 50% casualty rate that made every mission a coin flip between survival and death in a freezing Perspex bubble bolted to the rear of a 4-engine bomber. The Fraser-Nash FN-20 turret measured 38 inches wide and 42 inches tall, just enough room for a man sitting backward, facing the empty sky behind the aircraft, while wind screamed past at 180 miles per hour and temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Entry required crawling backward through a narrow opening from the fuselage, settling into a seat designed for long hours of isolation, and spending the flight scanning darkness for German fighters that usually attacked from behind and below where visibility ended and blind spots began. 4.303 Browning machine guns provided the only defense, and there was no room for a parachute inside the turret. Parachute packs stayed clipped to storage racks in the fuselage because the turret was too small, which meant that when a pilot gave the order to bail out, the tail gunner had to rotate his turret until the doors aligned with the fuselage opening, crawl forward into the bomber, grab his parachute from the rack, clip it onto his harness, and then find an exit and jump. 30 to 60 seconds if everything worked perfectly, if the aircraft remained stable, if fire hadn't blocked the path to the parachute, if time existed. Born December 10, 1922 in North Walsham, Norfolk, England, Nicholas Stephen Alkemade worked as a market gardener in Loughborough before war arrived in 1939 and changed the trajectory of his life along with millions of others. Enlistment in the Royal Air Force led to air gunner training and assignment to 115 Squadron based at RAF Wychford in Cambridgeshire put him in the rear turret of an Avro Lancaster heavy bomber that carried the heaviest bombs the RAF could deploy on night raids over Germany. His crew called the aircraft Werewolf, Serial number DS664, coded A4-K. 14 operational missions by March 1944 meant Alkemade had beaten the odds that killed half of all tail gunners, survived raids on Berlin through walls of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, while German night fighters prowled the darkness hunting for stragglers. Each mission added to the count, each return to base another day alive, each briefing for the next raid another roll of the dice. Mission 15 came up on March 24th. An afternoon briefing outlined the target as Berlin, maximum effort with 811 bombers from multiple squadrons converging on the German capital to drop their payloads and turn for home. Werewolf would carry a full bomb load on the 4-hour flight east across the North Sea and over Germany, drop on the city, and make the 4-hour return journey through whatever the Luftwaffe threw at them. 7 men climbed aboard that evening: Pilot Flight Sergeant Jack Newman, Flight Engineer Sergeant Edgar Warren, Bomb Aimer Sergeant Charles Hilder, Navigator Sergeant John Cleary, Wireless Operator Sergeant Jeffrey Burwell, Mid-Upper Gunner Sergeant John McDonough, and Tail Gunner Nicholas Alkemade, who crawled into his turret as Werewolf lifted off from RAF Wychford at 7 o'clock. Hours in the turret passed in cold darkness, Alkemade rotating left and right, scanning for the silhouette of a German fighter against the stars, watching the sky for any movement that might signal an attack. Berlin's defenses lit up the night when the bomber stream arrived, flak bursting in black puffs and searchlights sweeping across the formation. But Werewolf dropped her bombs on target and turned west for the long flight home. Strong northern winds that night pushed the returning bombers south of their planned route, and instead of reaching the relative safety of the North Sea, quickly the formation drifted over the Ruhr Valley. The Germans called it the Valley of Hell, and the name fit. Industrial heartland of the Reich, protected by more anti-aircraft batteries and night fighter squadrons than anywhere else in the country, flying over the Ruhr at night in a heavy bomber, was volunteering for death. 50 minutes before midnight, cannon fire erupted from the darkness below Werewolf. A Junkers Jew, 88 night fighter, flown by Oberleutnant Heinz Rucker of Nachtjagdgeschwader, II, had stalked the Lancaster from beneath, positioned itself in the blind spot under the bomber's belly, and opened fire with 20-millimeter cannons that ripped through the starboard wing and fuselage. Fuel ignited, flames exploded along the bomber's length and streamed back past Alkemade's turret in bright orange rivers that lit up the night. Cannon shells shattered the Perspex canopy around his position, exposing him to screaming wind and air so cold it burned his face. And through the turret doors he could see flames spreading through the fuselage from the ruptured fuel tanks. Alkemade swung his 4 Brownings toward the Ju-88 below and fired a burst, but the German fighter broke away into darkness, having already delivered the killing blow. Werewolf was finished, spiraling out of control with fire consuming her from nose to tail. Pilot Jack Newman's voice came over the intercom with an order every crew member feared: bail out. Maybe a minute remained, there may be less. Alkemade rotated his turret to align the doors with the fuselage, yanked the handle, shoved the doors open, and a wall of flame hit him in the face. Fire had spread through the entire fuselage from the wing tanks through the bomb bay, consuming everything in its path, and Alkemade could see his parachute pack on its storage rack about 6 feet away through the inferno. But reaching it meant crawling through flames hot enough to melt metal. Pushing forward into the fire seared his face and hands, beat him back when the pain became unbearable, and a second attempt produced the same result. The flames were too intense, the heat too overwhelming. He couldn't reach the parachute. And that's when he saw his parachute burning. The pack itself had caught fire, silk canopy inside already melting or consumed by flames. And even if he could somehow reach it and clip it on, the parachute wouldn't work because the parachute no longer existed as anything but melting fabric and charred straps. Alkemade pulled back into his turret and assessed his options with the cold clarity that comes when all choices lead to death. Staying in the turret meant burning alive as flames reached him, a process that would take minutes and involve pain beyond imagination. Should jumping without a parachute meant falling 18,000 feet and dying on impact with the ground, but the fall would last only 90 seconds and consciousness would likely end before impact. Terror for a minute and a half, then nothing. Burning for minutes, maybe longer, with no escape. Alkemade chose the fall, and years later, when asked about the decision, he put it simply, "I preferred the brief terror of falling to the prolonged agony of burning alive." Unclipping his parachute harness took seconds. If the useless straps that should have connected to the pack he'd never reach fell away, and Alkemade positioned himself at the turret opening where Perspex had been blown away by cannon fire. Looking down showed only darkness. Looking up revealed stars scattered across the night sky. And then he jumped. Wind caught him immediately and tumbled him away from the burning Lancaster. His arms and legs spreading to stabilize his fall into a flat face-down position that would carry him toward the invisible ground 3 miles below. Terminal velocity for a human body in freefall reaches about 120 miles per hour, achieved roughly 15 seconds after jumping, maintained for the remainder of the descent at a rate of 176 feet per second. Werewolf continued burning above him, flames visible against the darkness. So the bomber spiraling earthward with some crew already dead from cannon fire and others trying desperately to bail out if they could. 90 seconds separated Alkemade from impact, 90 seconds of consciousness and awareness that death approached at 120 miles per hour, 90 seconds of watching stars and feeling freezing wind and waiting for the end. Somewhere during that minute and a half, Alkemade lost consciousness. Perhaps from cold or lack of oxygen or his brain mercifully shutting down rather than face the final moments, and he has no memory of hitting the ground. Werewolf impacted near the village of Oberkirchen and exploded in a fireball that killed 4 crew members instantly. Pilot Jack Newman, flight engineer Edgar Warren, bomb aimer Charles Hilder, and mid-upper gunner John McDonough never escaped the aircraft. Navigator John Cleary bailed out with a damaged parachute and hit a tree during descent. Knocked unconscious, suffering a collapsed lung and severe frostbite from exposure to the freezing night. Wireless operator Jeffrey Burwell parachuted safely and was captured. Nicholas Alkemade fell through darkness unconscious, traveling at 120 miles per hour toward ground that should have killed him the moment he hit it. 3:15 in the morning on March 25, 1944, Alkemade opened his eyes and found himself staring up at stars through pine tree branches. Snow surrounded him. A cold seeped through his flight suit, and when he tried to move, his fingers responded. Toes moved when commanded, arms functioned, legs worked, left knee hurt badly enough to suggest a sprain, but nothing felt broken or shattered or catastrophically damaged. Moving carefully and testing each limb revealed burns on his face and hands from the fire, cuts on his head and thigh from shattered Perspex shards embedded in his skin, bruising across his torso from the impact, but no compound fractures. No arterial bleeding, no massive trauma that should have resulted from falling 18,000 feet and hitting the earth at terminal velocity. A sprained knee, some burns, some cuts, heavy bruising. Alive when physics insisted survival was impossible. What saved him was probability so unlikely that calculating odds becomes meaningless, a combination of factors that aligned in the only configuration that could turn a fatal fall into something survivable. A landing in a young fir forest near Schmallenberg meant hitting flexible pine trees whose branches bent rather than broke when his body struck them during descent, each branch providing a small deceleration, dozens of tiny slowdowns, adding up to a significant reduction in velocity by the time he reached the ground. Below the trees lay snow, 18 inches deep, protected from the sun by the canopy above. And when Alkemade finally hit that cushion, the snow compressed and absorbed the remaining energy of his fall. 20 feet away sat open ground with no snow coverage at all, and if he'd landed there, nothing would have saved him because the ground was frozen solid. But he didn't land there. Alkemade reached into his Irvin flying suit and pulled out his cigarette pack, somehow intact after the fall. I lit a cigarette and lay in the snow smoking while processing the reality that he was alive when every law of physics said otherwise. Walking proved impossible with his sprained knee, and freezing to death in the snow seemed like a poor outcome after surviving the fall. So he pulled out his RAF-issued distress whistle and blew several sharp blasts into the night air. German voices approached within minutes. A group of civilians, possibly from the Home Guard, found him lying in snow with no parachute visible anywhere nearby, and they carried the British airman with burn marks on his face and cuts on his head to a local infirmary before transferring him to Mesquite Hospital for proper treatment. Doctors cleaned and bandaged his burns, removed Perspex splinters from his skin along with wood fragments from the pine trees, splinted his knee, and listened while Alkemade explained what had happened. Jumping from a burning aircraft at 18,000 feet without a parachute and surviving the fall to the ground. Doctors didn't believe the story because the story was impossible, and the logical explanation involved a spy who had parachuted into Germany and buried his parachute to hide evidence of infiltration. The Gestapo arrived shortly after and reached the same conclusion. German secret police interrogated Alkemade at his hospital bed, insisting that a British airman with no parachute must be a spy who'd infiltrated German territory, demanding to know where he'd hidden his equipment, threatening consequences if he didn't tell the truth. Alkemade repeated the same account he'd given doctors: aircraft shot down, parachute burned inside the bomber, jumped anyway, survived the fall, and if they wanted proof, they could search the wreckage and find his parachute exactly where he said it would be. The Gestapo sent a patrol to investigate the crash site at Oberkirchen. German soldiers picked through twisted metal and burned components scattered across the forest, found the bodies of 4 crew members burned beyond recognition, discovered ammunition and bomb racks and shattered guns among the wreckage, and located Nicholas Alkemade's parachute pack still clipped to its storage rack in what remained of the fuselage. Exactly where Alkemade said it would be, a silk canopy inside, charred and melted and completely destroyed by fire, never used, never deployed, never leaving the aircraft. Every detail of Alkemade's account checked out. Returning to Mesquite Hospital, the Gestapo informed Alkemade that his story had been verified and issued an official certificate dated April 25, 1944, stating that Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade of the Royal Air Force had survived a fall from approximately 18,000 feet without a parachute after his aircraft was destroyed over Germany. The only time in recorded history that an enemy government certified an impossible survival with an official legal document. Word spread through the German military faster than official reports, and Luftwaffe pilots wanted to meet the British airman who had fallen from the sky. The German doctors examined him with fascination. Photographs were taken for documentation, and Alkemade became a celebrity among his captors as the man who couldn't be killed. Celebrity status earned him no special privileges, and in April 1944 he was transferred to Stalag Luft 3, the notorious prisoner-of-war camp in Silesia that held 10,000 Allied airmen behind barbed wire and guard towers. 2 weeks before Alkemade arrived at Stalag Luft 3, 76 prisoners had tunneled out of the camp on March 24th in what became known as the Great Escape, and 73 of them had been recaptured, with 50 subsequently murdered on Hitler's personal orders as a warning to other prisoners considering escape attempts. Assignment to a barracks with other RAF prisoners led to Alkemade telling his story about the fall, and nobody believed him until he produced the German certificate as proof. News spread through the camp within days, and the man who fell 18,000 feet became a legend among prisoners who had little else to occupy their time beyond waiting for the war to end. Standard POW existence at Stalag Luft 3 involved boredom, hunger, cold and uncertainty about liberation, and Alkemade spent his days like thousands of other prisoners, trying to stay sane while waiting for Allied forces to break through German defenses. January 1945 brought the Soviet army advancing from the east toward the camp, and rather than allow 10,000 Allied prisoners to be liberated by Russians, the Germans ordered a forced evacuation in the middle of a blizzard. Temperature at 22 degrees below zero, the entire camp population marched west toward Germany on foot through snow and ice with minimal food and no shelter. Hundreds died during what became known as the Long March, killed by exposure and exhaustion and starvation. But Nicholas Alkemade, who had survived falling 18,000 feet, also survived walking hundreds of miles through a January blizzard. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Allied forces liberated the surviving prisoners, and Alkemade returned to England and went back to Loughborough to resume the life he'd left when war started. Market gardening work waited for him, quiet, normal existence away from bombers and fire and falling through darkness. Newspapers discovered his story and published articles about the miracle airman, interviewing him repeatedly. And Alkemade always gave the same account because the account was true, and the German certificate provided undeniable proof. Employment at British Nylon Spinners chemical plant gave him steady work for decades, and life settled into a routine that had nothing dramatic about it. But fate apparently hadn't finished with Nicholas Alkemade. On the 1950s brought a chemical explosion at the plant that injured several workers, and Alkemade walked away with minor injuries. An electrical shock incident in the 1960s that should have been fatal left him shaken but alive. A serious car crash in the 1970s that totaled his vehicle resulted in him walking away with bruises. Colleagues joked that death had given up trying to kill Alkemade, that he was indestructible, that the universe had decided his survival of the fall meant he got to keep surviving everything else. Physicists and doctors have spent decades analyzing how Alkemade survived a fall that should have killed him instantly, examining the forces involved and the probability of the outcome. Terminal velocity of 120 miles per hour creates an impact force equivalent to hitting a solid wall in a car at that speed. And human bodies cannot withstand that force because bones shatter, organs rupture, and death occurs before consciousness can register what happened. What saved Alkemade was cumulative deceleration across dozens of impacts, each pine branch he struck during his fall, bending and absorbing a small amount of kinetic energy, 20 or 30 branches adding up to a substantial reduction in his final velocity. Reaching the ground at perhaps 60 or 80 miles per hour instead of 120 still represents a potentially fatal impact. But the 18-inch snow cushion compressed and absorbed more energy, while his body hit at an angle that spread the force rather than concentrating it. Youth helped. At 21 years old, he was fit and flexible, and everything aligned in the only configuration that could produce survival. Other airmen fell from great heights during the war and lived to talk about it, including American ball turret gunner Alan McGee, who fell 22,000 feet in January 1943 when his B-17 was shot down over France and crashed through the glass roof of a train station, the shattering glass absorbing enough energy to leave him severely injured but alive. Soviet Lieutenant Ivan Chisov fell 23,000 feet in January 1942 and hit a snow-covered ravine at an angle that let him survive with a fractured pelvis and spine. But Alkemade remains the only one whose survival was certified by enemy authorities with an official document, and that German certificate transformed an incredible survival story into verified historical fact that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or myth. In 1998, navigator John Cleary, who had been one of 3 survivors from Werewolf's crew, traveled to Germany and met Oberleutnant Heinz Roecker, the Ju-88 pilot who had shot down their aircraft 54 years earlier on that March night, when 7 young men flew into darkness and only 3 came home. Standing together in the forest near Oberkirchen, where the Lancaster had crashed, two old men remembered a night that had ended 4 lives and changed 3 others forever. Rooker expressed sorrow for the deaths, acknowledged he'd been doing his duty as a night fighter pilot, but never forgot shooting down Werewolf. And when Cleary told him that Nicholas Alkemade had survived falling without a parachute, Rooker could hardly believe it, despite having heard rumors during the war. Jack Newman, Edgar Warren, Charles Hilder, and John McDonough lie buried together in Hanover War Cemetery, their graves standing as a reminder that for every impossible survival, there are countless others who didn't make it home from missions over Germany. June 22, 1987. Nicholas Alkemade died at age 64 in his sleep from natural causes, finally succumbing to something that couldn't be beaten by luck, or pine trees, or snow cushions. On his own terms, the man who fell 18,000 feet without a parachute died peacefully in bed after 43 years of post-war life. 18,000 feet fallen, 0 parachutes deployed, 90 seconds of freefall, 120 miles per hour terminal velocity, 18 inches of snow, 3 hours unconscious, 1 sprained knee, 0 broken bones, a 100% survival. The numbers tell a story that defies belief until you see the German certificate dated April the 25th, 1944, preserved in the RAF Museum in London as the only official enemy certification of an impossible survival in military history. When asked about the jump years later, Alkemade described the decision as simple: stay and burn or jump and die quickly, and he chose the jump. Falling felt peaceful once consciousness faded, almost like floating, and he never expected to wake up. Seeing stars above him when he opened his eyes, it took several seconds to realize this wasn't the afterlife, but actual survival against impossible odds. March 24, 1944, 811 bombers attacked Berlin, and hundreds of airmen died in the raid, shot down by flak or fighters, or killed in crashes, or captured and executed. Tail gunners across the bomber force faced their standard 50% casualty rate in isolated seats at the rear of 4-engine aircraft. He's scanning darkness and waiting for attacks that came from behind. One tail gunner fell 18,000 feet without a parachute and lived to tell about it, not because he was braver or special or protected by anything beyond physics and probability and blind luck. Nicholas Alkemade survived because he landed in the exact spot where flexible trees and deep snow and perfect angle combined to turn the physically impossible into the merely improbable. He, the man who fell from the sky, became a legend, not because he wanted fame, but because reality sometimes arranges itself in ways we can't predict, producing outcomes we can't explain. His story endures as a reminder that even when facing choices where every option leads to death, sometimes the universe aligns in configurations that allow survival when survival shouldn't be possible. Nicholas Alkemade jumped from a burning aircraft at 18,000 feet, fell for 90 seconds at terminal velocity, unhit the ground, and walked away with a sprained knee while German authorities certified what happened with an official document, and physics insisted the whole thing was impossible. The man lived 43 more years after that night. That's the story of the airman who fell from the sky.